Hi, I'm Dr. Glenda Holcomb, and today I want to talk a little bit about risk management. Do a little bit of explaining about risk management, or at least take a stab at some of the explanations around risk management, since all kinds of risk can be experienced in all types of projects. And during this time, I'll tell you a couple of stories about what I've experienced over the years of being in projects and a part of risk management. So there are a lot of standards and process models out there to describe risk management. And you would think that this workflow or these steps that are becoming so known and practiced across projects would now just be secondhand on every project, but that isn't exactly true. But if you're interested in finding some of the standards and process models, IEEE and their software and systems engineering, the NIST, ISO, the International Organization of Standards, and then of course you have the Carnegie Mellon University and the process improvement, or those areas that also come out of PMI, that will define and describe for you risk management in a very process-oriented role. So is it really targeting a risk, or are risk the actual target for the process? It's kind of hard to decipher at times. But overall, what we want to do when we start to look at risk management as a part of every project is, how does the overall process of identifying and managing risk bring value to the organization? Organizations who have a very mature project management baseline and a process baseline should also have a very mature process for doing risk management, the identification, the assessment, the prioritizing, how it's going to be mitigated, or even how it might be accepted. And if we look at the areas of risk management, we want to use these to help us in our decision making. I had a mentor once who said, always make some type of decision, because if you just stand still and don't make a decision, you'll never know if you're right or wrong. But if you make a decision, then walking down that path of the decision can then tell you sooner if you have made a bad decision. Therefore, you can correct at that point. If you just stand waiting on more information, you may never make a decision, which could also be entering into a risk that you are unaware of. The process of risk management should be systematic, it should be structured, it should be repeatable on every single project within a program. And the reality of it is that the risk process doesn't change because the type of project has changed. A lot of people don't understand this. They think that to manage the risk for a construction project where you're going to build a building is very different than the process for software development. The reality of it is the process is the same, although the risk identified, of course, are different. You must take a look at the human factors in risk management as well. If you have a seasoned team of experienced subject matter experts, then your risk on a project may not be as high as if you have a series or a group of very junior people on your project. And the difference between those two levels of risk also define how much mitigation or how much you might have to put aside in the money part of it to mitigate those risks. And key to all, you have to be adaptable to continuously monitor and change your risk and tweak your process as you go on in any project. Most people today use a risk matrix. It's the probability by the impact, and it really doesn't matter what the probability is or the impact, but in the slide that you see here, it is a very qualitative process. But the whole factor of trying to do risk management so that you know how much it might cost you, then we must turn that qualitative aspect into a quantitative product. Let me explain by showing you this. So we use our most likely, less likely against negligible impact versus severe impact. And we start to put numbers around those. Probabilities around the probability that something may happen against the impact that if that risk happens, what happens to the project? So you're taking those qualitative aspects of what you have identified, and now you're starting to put some numbers around them. But you also have to notice that the numbers are kind of, pulled out of thin air as well. I mean, is there a real difference between something that is 20% probability of a risk, or that means very low, or the 21 to 40%, which means low? Although for impact, we definitely can see the difference between negligible and minor. But does everybody know the definition between moderate and significant? And how is that different than severe? So how do we do this? Well, we can pull the historical records of projects that our company or our organization has worked on in the past. Subject matter experts, people who have worked these types of projects and can tell you what has worked and hasn't worked and where there have been problems on similar type projects that they have seen over the years. You can run simulations. You can do Delphi charts. And of course, there's always the WAG, or the wild ass guess, or the SWAG, which is the scientific wild ass guess. But there are limitations to both. What I don't like about most risk management matrices is it never puts into prospect a risk that may be very low probability, and let's say even just 1%. But if it occurs, the impact is severe or critical. In this situation, you are still only looking at a medium risk. And I have worked projects where that is not the case. There are some projects you may work that it doesn't matter how low the probability is. You must mitigate that risk. Let me tell you an example. How many of you remember the Challenger? Challenger was the shuttle that blew up in the 80s. And unfortunately, I was one of those lieutenants sitting in the Air Force who had friends and myself who had to brief and work this event. It was our job in the Air Force as space operations analyst to let our senior leadership know that a significant, a critical event had occurred, that the Challenger had blown up, and that 7 lives were lost. Okay, so if you look at the normal risk management assessment, this would have only been a medium risk. Lots of other risks were probably mitigated long before this one was, and you put money in those places. The risk that the Challenger would blow up or something severe happen was very low. It was actually less than 1%, or at least that's what was calculated by some of the engineers at NASA. But the impact, we have to say, was very severe. And I will stand by this forever, that there are some risks that should be mitigated no matter what. This was one of them. And Challenger, because of the cold, because the O-rings were never designed to work in temperatures below freezing, the Challenger should have never launched that day. And I think most of you would agree. So up till now, we've covered the matrix, and we've looked at the probability versus impact of risk. I've shown you places where you can find standards for risk management and the risk process workflow. So now let's look at that workflow. It doesn't matter what type of project you are working. The overall process is the same. Shouldn't matter whether you are coding software or if you're building a building. The overall process is the same to identify, mitigate, manage risk. So we look at the overall process of identify risk. You're going to measure what is the potential impacts and probability. You'll organize those risks. You'll manage those risks, which means you are constantly revisiting those risks. And once you mitigate one risk, you may find other risks that come about. So the identification of risk is an ongoing process, and so is the management. You can accept risk. These are risks that doesn't matter the probability. The impact to my organization is so low that I can accept that risk, and if it happens, it's not going to cost a whole lot of money to make that correct. So if my vendor who delivers hardware is consistently a day late, well, I accept that risk because I can probably accept that, server a day later. If it's something that I absolutely can't accept because of timelines and other schedules, then I need to mitigate that risk. Maybe I put the order in for that piece of hardware several days earlier than I normally would have. That may affect a little of my cash flow, but at least I have mitigated the risk of my hardware being late. I might transfer that risk. I may get another vendor to come in to do that. I may assign a specific resource to watch the triggers and take account, and start to mitigate that risk only if the trigger is there. I may transfer that risk by buying insurance, i.e., I have extra spares, or I actually take out an insurance policy. This is what we do on a lot of satellite programs, because you cannot recoup any part of the satellite if it blows up on the launch pad. A lot of satellite makers take insurance out, so They don't get the satellite and they're not getting the capability anytime soon, but at least they can recoup their $1 million from the blow up. And then there are those risks that we just avoid. I know my vendor is always late, so instead I get another vendor. I terminate one, I get someone else who has a better track record. And then throughout the project, we are constantly reporting so that there are no surprises to our stakeholders or to senior management when issues come up. So here we have kind of, the funny, attack the risk before the risk attack you. Well, just remember, not every risk is mitigated and not every risk is accepted. You have to understand the risk and constantly assess to understand then what actions you need to take for risk management and risk mitigation. Risks are not mitigated by not making any decision. By making no decision, you are asking for risk to happen to you. And it puts you in a place where all you are doing is being reactive. Some risk must be taken for a project to be successful. I may take a risk on a young coder instead of going with the senior guy. But the young coder can code at 2.5 times faster than the older guy. Or vice versa. Others must be avoided or mitigated. The shuttle, I think we all know, should not have launched that day. Bottom line is, no one knows exactly which risk governs any of these statements. So as a project manager, I wish you luck. So we've kind of gone over risk management at a very high level in the mitigation and even the catastrophic effects of doing poor risk management or not doing risk management at all. So I hope you've learned some lessons, and I hope you enjoyed this lesson.